All right, aloha and welcome to my talk, Harnessing Weapons of Mac Destruction. Thank you for the introduction. My name, yes, is Patrick Wardle, the creator of Objective-C Mac security website and tool suites. I recently worked at a company called Digita Security. We were recently acquired by Jamf, so now I work at Jamf. So today we're going to be talking about repurposing other people's Mac malware for our own surreptitious or offensive purposes. So we'll start by showing why, if you are an evil hacker or perhaps someone on a red team, this is actually a very good idea. And then we'll show exactly how such a hacker or an attacker would go through and repurpose these malware specimens. Now, of course, if we are doing this for offensive cyber capabilities, we'll want to make sure that these repurposed or reprogrammed malware specimens are not detected by Apple's built-in malware mitigations. So we'll talk about bypassing those as well. And then finally, because we also want to make sure that Mac users are protected against these threats, we'll talk about methods to generically detect them via runtime detection. So this last part of the talk will kind of be a more defensive, from a more defensive point of view, and ideas perhaps we can build into our own security products so that even if people are repurposing Mac malware, we can still detect it. So let's dive in. So here we have a diagrammatic overview that conceptually explains the repurposing process. So imagine Spy A has developed some neat, sophisticated, fully featured Mac malware and has deployed it to various targets. So Spy B then somehow captures this malware, perhaps either in transit as the Spy A is installing it on a system, or perhaps they pull it off an infected system. Spy B then takes this malware sample, this binary, into her lab and repurpose it. So we've mentioned this term repurposing a few times. What exactly do we mean by repurposing? Well, we'll get into this more shortly, but essentially you can think of it as reconfiguring the malware, often at the binary level. So even if you didn't write the actual malware, you can use it for your own evil or offensive purposes. So for example, as we can see on the slide, once the repurposed malware has been redeployed now to Spy B's target, instead of beaconing back to Spy A's command and control infrastructure, it'll talk to a server that Spy B controls. Now you might be thinking, okay, this seems like a reasonable idea, but why should we be doing this? And I think there's two reasons that will actually illustrate, if you're a hacker, the question should be really, why not? So first, there are incredibly well-funded, well-resourced, very motivated hackers, APT groups, and three-letter agencies that are creating amazing malware that's fully featured and has been tested, a lot of times on targets in the wild. Now, I'm rather lazy. I would rather be taking a nap or surfing as opposed to writing malware, even if I was a hacker. I'm not saying I do this, but if I was. So it makes sense to let these agencies, these entities, these groups create the malware, and then for us to simply repurpose those. Second, if our repurposed creations ever get detected, ever get caught, it's very likely that they will be misattributed to the original authors, so no one will ever suspect us. So again, you might think, okay, that seems reasonable, but if this is such a good idea, why aren't hackers or APT groups or nation states already doing this? And the answer is, well, they actually are. So another important aspect or takeaway of this talk is this is something that's actually going on already that we need to be more aware of. Now, I can't really comment on this, but there have been some leak slides from the National Security Agency, which is the US government's hacking spy agency. And in those leaked slides, it appears to indicate that the NSA has such a capability. Also, recent reporting from the New York Times seems to indicate that the Chinese are doing this as well. So to these really well-resourced agencies, the benefit of using this repurposed malware is twofold. First, it allows them to deploy these malware samples or specimens into risky environments. So imagine you're the National Security Agency, you hack a high-value target, and you see that the Chinese or perhaps the Russians have also hacked that target and are already there. Now, it doesn't make sense for you to install your own personal implants that you spent years developing, because it's likely the Russians or the Chinese who are also on that system will notice and maybe grab a copy. So instead, what you can do is simply take another country's implant that's reconfigured and deploy that. And if it gets caught, if it gets discovered by the other actors on that box, who really cares? Also, for these agencies, attribution is very important, right? The Russians don't like it when you say, oh, the Russians are doing this. NSA doesn't like it when something's attributed back to the NSA. So again, by using these repurposed malware samples, if they get uncovered, either by the victim or some antivirus product, it's likely that that will get misattributed back to the original creator. So again, if the NSA is repurposing Russian malware, the Russians are still probably going to get blamed, which we always like. Now, of course, there are challenges to repurposing other people's malware. It's not super basic. If it was, we really wouldn't be talking about it. But we'll see these challenges are really not insurmountable, which is a good thing. So first, generally speaking, you're not going to have this source code to these samples. Usually when you capture or you find someone else's malware, it's simply the binary, the compiled application or daemon or utility. So what we have to do is we have to reverse engineer the malware at the binary level. Now, when we're studying the malware, this is kind of the analysis stage, we're generally aiming to understand the malware, answering questions such as how does it persist and how does it communicate. Then, once we have an understanding of that, we can go ahead and reconfigure and repurpose it. For example, once we uncover where the addresses for the command and control servers are, for example, embedded in the malware, we can go and patch those out and change those instead to talk to our command and control server. If the malware has the ability to talk to a remote server, perhaps it has some tasking mechanism, we also have to understand that protocol and create a custom command and control server. This means that when we deploy the reconfigured malware and it connects back to us, we will then be able to talk to it, task it, but we have to understand the protocol. And finally, since we're generally repurposing known malware samples, it's likely that there are known AV signatures, either that Apple has created, in XProtect and MRT, or perhaps in standard third-party AV products. So we're going to also talk about how to overcome those as well. Now, I want to reiterate, if you're repurposing someone else's malware, it's very important to take those obstacles seriously and get them right, because if you get them wrong, bad things can happen. So here we have an example of a piece of malware that we believe we've fully repurposed. We found the embedded addresses of the command and control servers. We've changed those to instead point to a server we control, and then we happily deploy it. Well, it turns out we didn't change the addresses of the backup command and control servers. So those still point to the hacker's original servers. This means if our servers ever go offline or there's a network issue, the redeployed malware, which we think has been fully repurposed, is going to try to communicate back to the hacker's original command and control server. And if we've redeployed this malware to a whole bunch of new targets, we've basically just given the original hackers access to those targets as well. Here's another real-world example. In this case, the hacker didn't repurpose the malware per se, but rather simply planted existing malware to fake attribution. This was a kind of interesting scenario. In a nutshell, a student was accused of hacking or changing her grades, and this actually happened. What she did, though, she went back and said, no, it couldn't have been me because my Mac is infected with all this malware. So obviously a hacker had come in and then used my computer to do all sorts of evil things. I can't be responsible for this. And that seemed like a reasonable defense until we took a closer look at what malware was on her computer. The two samples were a piece called ColdRoot and one called Crossrat. Now, these are decently well-known pieces of Mac malware, but if we take a closer look at it, her argument really makes zero sense. So first, ColdRoot doesn't actually run on recent versions of macOS. It was a proof-of-concept malware that was never in the wild. The only place you can get it is downloading it from public Mac malware collections. So again, if you try to run it on a Mac computer, it's going to crash. The other piece of malware she had, again claiming that hackers had infected her computer, was a cross-platform rat or remote admin Trojan called Crossrat. However, this was built or created by the Lebanese government to target other governments and military targets. It would never end up on a student's computer in the United States. So clearly what this student had done was simply just gone out to the web, downloaded some Mac malware samples, not even run them, put them on our system and say, hey, my computer is infected. Again, reasonable argument, but once we look into the malware, makes no sense. So the point is, if you're going to repurpose other people's malware, make sure you kind of choose plausible samples. All right, so now let's talk about exactly how we repurpose other people's malware with the goal of making their malware ours. So the first step is selecting what you want your malware to do. And this is based on two criteria. As I mentioned, first is you generally choose what kind of malware you're looking for. Are you looking for something to mine cryptocurrency for you? Do you want to encrypt users' files? Are you looking for a backdoor that you can deploy to new systems, or a fully featured implant? And then second, maybe attribution is important to you. Are you looking for a sample that will likely be misattributed to a US intelligence agency, or perhaps a Russian hacking group? So on my website, objectivec.com, I have a very comprehensive collection of public Mac malware samples. So that's a great place to start. And actually, all the samples we're talking about today, you can go and grab them from my site if you want to play around with them or test them against your security product. Now, once you've selected the piece of malware, the cryptocurrency miner, the ransomware, the backdoor, it's time to analyze this. And as I mentioned, in terms of repurposing or reconfiguring the sample, the main goals include things like uncovering logic that deals with remote interactions. For example, you want to figure out how the malware determines the addresses of the command and control servers, as obviously you will want to change those to point to the addresses of your server. If the malware does talk to a remote server, as we mentioned, you'll need to understand that logic, the protocol, again, so you can task it. And then finally, you might have to create a custom command and control server so that you can talk to that. And I think we talk about this a little more. So now once you've figured out how you want to modify the sample, it's now time to actually reconfigure or repurpose it. And generally, as I mentioned, since we don't have source code, this will mean modifying bytes in the actual binary. So here, for example, we have a piece of malware. We can see directly embedded within it is the address of the command and control server, right? 89.34.11.113. That's the hacker's original server. What we want to do is we want it to talk to our own server. So what we do is we simply change it. So in this case, we go and we patch that out. I'm running this in a test VM. That's why it's a 192 address. And we can see, though, once we've reconfigured or modified the IP address directly in the binary, when we run that malware sample, it now connects out to our command and control server. As I mentioned, if the malware or backdoor is going to expect tasking, a lot of malware, right, beacons out and says what you want me to do. Now it's talking to our servers, we have to give it tasking, which means we have to create a custom command and control server or a CNC server. As I mentioned, this will ensure that we can now task the repurposed malware once we deploy it to new systems. Now, creating such a command and control server really doesn't have to be anything fancy. I usually just whip up a Python script. But if you are seriously considering using repurposed malware in a large hack or attack, it's probably better to write a fully featured server. At DEF CON a few years ago, I talked about writing a custom command and control server. The focus of that talk, though, was to discuss how to analyze a sample by simply creating a server and talking to it. But that's a good talk because it describes how we go about actually building a command and control server for any piece of malware. OK, so we kind of talked now about the steps you go through to repurpose a piece of malware. What we're going to do now is we're going to walk through some actual samples to show exactly how an adversary or a red team participant could go about repurposing pieces of malware. And we're going to start with one called Fruitfly. So Fruitfly is rather a unique piece of Mac malware. It was written about 15 years ago, but it remained undetected and fully operational till about 2 or 3 years ago. It's a fully featured backdoor. It supports a myriad of capabilities, so it really is a perfect candidate for us to repurpose. Again, the hackers spent years adding all these great features and capabilities, so if we're looking for an interactive backdoor, like why write your own, right? Just take this one and repurpose it. Kind of the idea is work smart, not hard. As we'll see, it's actually very trivial to repurpose this, and thus gives us a proven, fully featured malware that we can use for our own evil purposes. Now, Fruitfly is written in Perl, though it's highly obfuscated. If we take a peek at the backdoor, we can see that there is some logic in the script that is parsing command line arguments. And specifically what it's doing, it's looking for an IP address and port combo that you can, again, pass in via the command line. This means what we can do is we can simply pass in the address of our own command and control server without actually having to modify the malware at all. This is great. So for example, if we get access to a Mac system and we want to install this backdoor, if we persist it as a launch agent, you can actually pass command line arguments. So what we do is we simply specify the address of our own command and control server, and then every time the system is rebooted, the malware will beacon to our servers for tasking. So we can see it's pretty trivial to repurpose that backdoor. That's really all we have to do on the client side. But to deploy it, we need an installer. The original installer was never uncovered. It's not sure if there was one or how the hacker used it. But turns out it's really easy to write our own. So I wrote one few lines of Python. It's available on Pastebin. Basically, all it does is once you've gained access to a Mac system, it installs the malware exactly in the same way that the hacker did it. Again, we want to mimic as much as we can the original hacker. So if these newly infected systems are ever uncovered, the original hacker will be blamed, not us. So I had previously written a custom command and control server that I used in the DEF CON talk to analyze that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that here. So here we have the custom command and control server on the left. And on the right, we have the installer for the now repurposed malware. So we're going to run the installer. And as we see, it's going to, we start the command and control server. We run the malware, and then the malware is going to connect out to our command and control server. We support all these commands. These are the commands that the malware supports. And one of those commands is take a screenshot. So what we can do is we can now tell the malware to take a screenshot, or screen capture. It'll do that and send it back to us. Again, this is amazing. All we had to do is simply give it a new address of a command and control server, and then give it that command. And now we have a fully featured Mac backdoor that we can deploy to all sorts of interesting targets that supports all these features. So again, the idea is kind of work smart, not hard. All right, so that was a backdoor. Let's now talk about repurposing a cryptocurrency miner, because maybe you want to make lots of money, but you really don't want to spend your time writing one of these from scratch. So our target is Creative Update. This was a cryptocurrency miner that was spread via Trojanized applications on the popular website macupdate.com. So what would happen is the attackers would modify or provide links to Trojanized versions of popular applications like Firefox. Then when users went to macupdate.com and downloaded what they thought was a pristine copy of Firefox, when they ran it in the background, it would install a cryptocurrency miner and infect the system. So let's look a little closer at the malware, because again, the first step is you always want to gain a comprehensive understanding of the malware before you repurpose it, right? It's good to know exactly how it works. So we mount the malicious disk image. Looks like it's Firefox, but in the resource directory, there's a binary, or rather a file called script. And if we look at this assembly of the main application's code, we can see it executing this script file. So let's take a look at this script. It's written in Bash, so pretty easy to see exactly what it does. We can see it first launches the pristine copy of the application that the user downloaded. It'd be weird if you downloaded what you thought was Firefox, and when you double-clicked it, nothing happened. So the first thing they do is they make sure they launch the actual copy of Firefox, which again is embedded in this Trojanized application. They then reach out to a download server that was actually hosted on Adobe's cloud and download a zip file called mdworker.zip. It then extracts this and persistently installs something named mdworker out of this file. If we look at the launch agent plist that persists the malware, we can see the path to the command line arguments they pass in. And if we execute the binary that they persist, we can actually see it's a legitimate cryptocurrency miner belonging to a company called MinerGate. So MinerGate is a cryptocurrency company. They provide a command line utility for mining cryptocurrency. What the hackers did was simply took that, packaged it up into these malicious Trojan applications, got them onto macupdate.com, and then started infecting users all around the world. The good thing for us, if we want to repurpose this, we can see that the address of the cryptocurrency mining, or rather the user, again, is passed in directly via the command line. So we can see the -user and then the account where the cryptocurrency mining result should go to, and then also the type of the cryptocurrency. In this case, it's XMR or Monero. So similar to Fruitfly, since the relevant configuration parameters are passed via the command line, it makes it very easy to repurpose this malware. We don't actually have to go into the binary and start messing with bits. So all we do is we modify the plist, the launch agent plist, and we change it to give it our own cryptocurrency account. So obviously, we don't want to give the attacker's original account. What we then do is, instead of having the malware reach out to a download server to download the cryptocurrency miner, we basically just embed that directly into the Trojanized application. This makes it more simpler and more self-contained. You don't need a secondary download server. And then we simply tweak the script. So instead of going out to download and running that, it just executes the cryptocurrency miner directly from the application bundle, because we've just added that. And then finally, we just repackage everything up, and now we have this nice Firefox DMG, which has to find a way to get users to run it. So again, demo time. We're going to run the repurposed currency miner. So this is the Trojanized Firefox.app. The user launches it. OK, looks like Firefox is running. Nothing too suspicious. But if we look and we go in the background, we can now see that the application has persistently installed the cryptocurrency miner, MD worker. And again, since we've repurposed it, we've provided our own address. So this is going to start cryptocurrency mining for us, and any results will now be sent to our cryptocurrency account. So we make lots of money. Hooray. So we're going to stick on this idea of making money, because we all like to make money, right? So perhaps you want to deploy some ransomware. Again, we're too lazy to write our own. Now, I say probably don't do this, because if you're deploying ransomware, you're kind of an ass. But again, hackers are doing this or have the capabilities to do it. This is why we're talking about it today. So here we're going to now talk about how to repurpose KeyRanger. KeyRanger was the first fully functional in-the-wild piece of ransomware targeting macOS. What hackers did, rather creatively, is they were able to infect a binary called transmission.app. It's a popular BitTorrent client. And the way they did it was they actually hacked the developer's website. So I don't know how, but somehow they got access to the legitimate website that would distribute transmission, and then modified the copies that were available for download. So for users, this kind of sucked, because they would go to Transmission's legitimate website, and when they downloaded what they thought was the actual application, instead they would get some ransomware. So if we look at the binary's code, we can see that it executes something called general.rtf out of the application bundle. And general.rtf might appear to be a document based on looking at the application, or sorry, its icon and name. But if we run the file command, we can see actually it's a malicious mock-O binary. So what this embedded binary does is it first sleeps for a few days. Then it connects out to a remote command and control server. And it expects a response that consists of a public RSA encryption key and decryption instructions. It then uses this key to encrypt all of the user's files, and then displays the decryption instructions demanding a ransom. So now let's talk about how we can repurpose this. First, we don't want our sample to wait for 3 days. We're rather impatient. So obviously, once it gets on a system, we want it to begin encrypting and ransoming the files right away. So as you can see on the slide, we simply nop out the instructions. There's a call that calls into a function that will sleep for 3 days. We just change those bytes to be 90, which translates to a no-op or do nothing instruction. And this effectively means now that call will be skipped and the malware will begin encrypting right away. We then modify the addresses of the servers that the ransomware connects out to for the encryption key and the decryption instruction. Because obviously, we want to be able to provide our own public encryption key and also our own decryption instructions. As we can see on the slide, if we look closely, the addresses for these command and control servers are embedded directly in the malware's binary. So what we do is we just go in a hex editor and change those to point to our addresses instead. And here I set them to 127.0.0.1 for local testing purposes. Now we need a server which has to respond to the ransomware with our own encryption key and decryption instructions. Turns out this is very easy to do. In fact, we can just put the expected response in a text file and then serve it up via netcat. So we can see there's the public RSA encryption key and the decryption instructions. We base64 encode those, put them in a file, and then the malware, when it connects out to us, remember we've changed the addresses of the command and control server, so it's going to talk to us instead, it will get these results. So again, here is a demo. We're going to execute the now repurposed version of KeyRanger. We're going to see it connect out to our command and control server. And again, this is going to provide it with our own encryption key and the decryption instructions. So once the malware has that information, it's going to start encrypting all the files. Again, this is happening in the background. The user thinks transmission is running, but we can see that all the files are being ransomed. When it's done being ransomed, it will display the decryption instructions. Those are the ones we sent from the server. And here you can say, it basically says, your files are encrypted. Please send money to an address. Obviously, you would have more detailed instructions. You would probably want to do this over Tor, maybe use Bitcoin. Don't put your personal email address, but you get the idea. All right, the last sample we're going to talk about repurposing is called Windtail. Windtail is a lovely backdoor written by a very sophisticated APT group. And here we'll talk about exploiting, or rather repurposing, both their exploit and their backdoor. So one of the most interesting pieces of this malware was that it was used to target individuals of a Middle Eastern government. So it was a fairly sophisticated piece of malware, as I mentioned, used by a decently successful APT group. And it was interesting the way they got access to Mac systems. They did that by abusing legitimate features of Mac OS, specifically custom URL schemes. So I wrote a detailed blog post about this if you're interested in all the details. But basically, in a nutshell, if an application supports a custom URL scheme, Mac OS will automatically register that custom URL scheme. So what an attacker can do is they can host that on a web page. It'll be downloaded. The system will register the scheme, and then that can be launched directly from the web page. So in terms of the backdoor, it persists as a login item, and it supports a variety of neat features, such as file exfiltration. And it does this, for example, by finding files of interest, zipping them up, and then using macOS's built-in curl command to send it to the attacker's command and control server. The backdoor also supports the ability to download files. So if we reverse engineer the malware, we can see a method called SDF. And what it does is it makes two requests. It connects out to the custom command, or to the hacker's command and control server to ask for the name of the file, what it should be saved as on the client-infected system, and then makes a second request to get the actual contents for the file. So if we run a network monitor, we can see when we run this piece of malware, for example, in a virtual machine, it connects out to get first the name of the file and then download the actual file contents. The backdoor will then execute that command. If we look at the disassembly, we can see once it gets the command, or rather the file from the hacker's command and control server, it will execute it with the NS task, I believe, API. Yeah, so it does an NS task alloc init, and then task launch. If we run a process monitor, we can passively observe this. So basically, the malware also has the ability to execute and download the file. The last feature of Windtail is it has the ability to remotely self-delete. Now, this is actually a really neat feature. Imagine the police are knocking on your door because you're distributing repurposed malware. It'd be really great if you could just upload a quick command to your server and then all your systems that you've infected uninstalled or cleaned themselves up. So malware gives us this capability. Specifically, every time it runs, it connects out to the command and control server to a certain API endpoint. And if that endpoint returns a 1, it deletes itself, and then terminates. So again, a very powerful capability to have in a piece of malware. So now we have a decent understanding of both the exploit and the malware. We're going to talk about how we can repurpose this. So if we were evil hackers, we could use this beautiful piece of malware for our own malicious purposes. So first, let's talk about repurposing the exploit. Turns out it's pretty simple to create a malicious web page that will automatically download a zip file when the user browses to it. Since Safari by default automatically extracts zip files, the application will now be sitting on the file system. Now, the user hasn't launched it yet. It's just going to be sitting in the downloads directory. But because the application contains a custom URL scheme, macOS will automatically register that scheme for us. It's kind of nice for Apple to do that from an evil point of view. You can see then on line 11, the last line of code in our exploit code in JavaScript, we then launch or make a request to that URL. Since our application, the malware, has been registered to handle that, the operating system will attempt to launch that. Now, there will be a pop-up, but a lot of users will click through this. So here's a demo of this in action. Once the user browses to the malicious website, we can see the file has been downloaded in the background. There's going to be one pop-up, and then another pop-up. And if the user clicks on this, the system will now be fully infected with our repurposed version of Windtail. Now, the beautiful thing about this exploit is it doesn't exploit any memory corruption. So it's very stable, and it's not really something Apple can patch. They basically say, we show a display to the user, but you can, as an attacker, control various aspects of that message. And as we all know, some amount of users will click things. That's probably an understatement. So now let's talk about repurposing the binary, because now we have a way to reuse their exploit to redeploy their backdoor. We need to talk about how to reconfigure the backdoor so it'll talk to our command and control servers instead of theirs. So the first thing we have to do is modify the addresses of the command and control server. So when the malware starts and goes to beacon out, it talks to our server. Unfortunately, though, the addresses of the command and control servers are encrypted, so we can't easily just modify them in a hex editor. But we can kind of do a neat trick to decrypt them at runtime. So the first thing we do is we slightly modify the binary, and we replace one of the dynamic libraries it has a reference to but doesn't use to our own dynamic library that we add to the application bundle. And now anytime the malware is run, for example, on a new target or a client system, it will load our own dynamic library. So what we can do then is once we're loaded into the address space of the malware, we will swap out, or in Apple's parlance, swizzle the encryption routine. And the idea is we're going to let the malware call into the decryption routine to decrypt the address of the command and control server and any other embedded strings. And because we've swapped out or swizzled the implementation transparently to the malware, it'll actually invoke our own decryption method. All our decryption method does is call into the malware's original decryption routine, because we don't know what the key is and we don't frankly care. We'll let it decrypt whatever string it was trying to decrypt. And if it was one of the addresses of the command and control server, we'll just then return our own. So this gives us a way to transparently swap out the addresses of the command and control servers at runtime without actually having to understand the malware's encryption and decryption protocols or implementation. So I added some debug statements to this, so you can see now when we run this, our dynamic library gets loaded into the process context of the malware. We can see it first decrypts some strings related to the file extensions. As I mentioned, the malware is interested in exfiltrating files, specifically those that match those extensions. But then we can see it starts decrypting the command and control servers. So we detect the flux2key.com. We know that's one of the command and control servers. So when that comes back from the decryption routine, it's calling back through our own implementation. We simply return our server.com. This means now the malware will use that string and connect to our servers instead of talking to the hacker's original infrastructure. Now, we have the ability to deploy the malware via the repurpose exploit. We have the ability for it to call back to our servers, but we need to write now a custom command and control server, so when it starts checking in and connecting with us, we can task it. We can do things like tell it to collect files, self-delete, etc., etc. Turns out this is really easy to do. When file exfiltration is performed, it simply posts files via an HTTP post request. So we can write a very simple Python server that looks for these post requests and then simply writes the files out to the system. So here's a demo of our custom command and control server receiving files from the repurposed malware. On the left, you can see the files we're saving out to disk. And on the main piece of the slide, these are the requests coming in from all the infected systems that we've deployed our repurposed malware to. We also want to extend our custom command and control server so that we can tell the malware to support download and execute. As we mentioned, the malware makes two requests. The first one is for the name of the file, that is what it should call the file on the infected system, and then the contents of the file. This comes in as a GET request. So again, very easy. In a few lines of Python, we basically pass back the name of the file we want it to call, and then when it calls out and makes that second request, the actual file contents. So we can watch this in action. Again, at the bottom, we have our custom command and control server. Then there's a VM that's running the piece of malware. It's that orange final presentation application in the library directory. And we'll see when it calls out, we're going to tell it to download and run an instance of calculator. So very simple, gets the request, we give it a name, contents of the files, and then it executes this. Well, we use calculator for illustrative purposes, but obviously if you were doing this in a real cyber operation, you perhaps would want to download and execute other tools, or perhaps even a second piece of malware. Finally, let's add capabilities to our custom command and control server so we can tell the malware to self-delete. As I mentioned earlier, this is a really nice capability. Perhaps you're done with a system, or perhaps the malware is being detected, or you get a knock on the door. It'd be really nice to have all the infected systems kind of just go away. So as I mentioned, connects out. All it does is it expects a response to be a 1, a string 1. So what we can do is we can simply respond with that 1, which will tell the malware to delete and terminate. So we have another demo of this. Again, we have our custom command and control server on the bottom. Piece of malware on the system. Again, it's that bright orange icon in the library directory. And we're going to see that when the malware connects out, we will tell it to self-delete. It will delete itself, and then it'll stop beaconing because obviously it's been terminated. So now this system has been fully cleaned, inoculated. So what we've done is we've just showed exactly how to repurpose a myriad of Mac malware. We talked about backdoors, ransomwares, cryptocurrency miners. However, we now need to talk about how to make sure that these repurposed samples aren't detected. As generally speaking, we're going to be repurposing known malware samples, which means macOS and third-party antivirus products are likely to detect or even block these variants, which would be bad from a hacker's point of view. So first up, we need to talk about macOS's built-in malware mitigations, such as XProtect, MRT, and code signing certificate checks. And at first glance, these kind of appear to be problematic because they're on all Macs, and if we think about it, they may block our malware even if we've repurposed it. So let's talk about how to repurpose this. This is important if we're designing or repurposing malware. And if we are more defensive-minded protectorates of Mac, it's important, I think, also to understand the limitations of these built-in products. So when users ask us, do Macs really need security products, we can resoundingly answer and say yes. So first is XProtect. XProtect is a built-in signature-based scanner that Apple ships with macOS. This is not something a ton of people know, especially end users. That is that there's actually a antivirus product built into macOS. Now, it's rather limited. It only scans files that the user downloads, and only the first time it's executed. If we look at its signatures, they're stored in a file called xprotect.yara. And as we can see on the slide, if we look at the signatures, there's signatures for common Mac malware, such as keyranger.a, which is the ransomware we repurposed previously. Now, since XProtect is purely signature-based, it's incredibly trivial to bypass. So let's take a closer look at the signature for keyranger. Again, this is a signature that Apple ships in XProtect on all recent versions of macOS. And what we can do is we take the signature and we can map it to a group of instructions. So these are the actual instructions in the ransomware that XProtect is scanning for. And if it finds them, a match of them, it's going to know that this binary is keyranger and not allow it to run. However, since it's signature-based, what we can do is we can flip one or two of those bits, and then the signature will no longer match, meaning XProtect will now no longer detect this malware. So what we can do, for example, we could either reorder the instructions or simply modify. In this case, we choose the latter. We change the number of bytes that can be written to a buffer from hex 400 to hex 300. Now, it's important to understand this doesn't change the functionality of the malware at all. This doesn't break or change anything. But since it changes one of the bytes that it's looking for, the signature will now no longer match, meaning the repurposed malware is now no longer detected by XProtect. So we're going to have another demo. On the left, we have the original sample of transmission, actually on the right. We're going to see that when we run it, XProtect is going to pop up an alert, and the user is not even going to have an option to run it. They're just going to be able to hit OK or cancel. We're then going to run the second piece. This is the instance we have repurposed and also changed that 1 byte to thwart XProtect's signature. So first, we double-click. This is the pristine instance. We can see macOS knows this is KeyRanger and says, go away. This is the second instance. It's going to say, hey, this is from the web. This is a standard application prompt. But we can see that if the user clicks OK, which they likely will because they've just downloaded it from the internet, we can see in the background the ransomware is now allowed to run because it no longer matches that XProtect signature. And so the user system will now be getting ransomed. So again, XProtect is signature-based approach, trivial to bypass. Now on to code signing checks. Most binaries on macOS are code signed. This is important because Gatekeeper by default allows code signed binaries. And so a lot of Mac malware is code signed. From Apple's point of view, this is a good thing as well because if they detect a piece of malware that's signed, they can simply revoke the certificate, and then that malware will no longer run on new systems. And this is exactly what happened with Windtail. So Windtail, again, the backdoor we repurposed, it's code signed. The certificate, though, has been revoked. So this means it's not even going to be allowed at all. The system will block it. Of course, we don't want our repurposed Windtail to be blocked. That would suck, right? So let's talk about how to bypass this. The problem is really not Windtail per se. It's the code signing certificate. So all we have to do is actually remove that code signing certificate, and it will be allowed to run. So there's a built-in utility called CodeSign. It has an undocumented flag, -- remove - signature. And if you execute this and pass it a binary or an application bundle that's been signed, it will remove that signature. So once we do that, we can now run that. However, you probably want to re-sign it with a developer ID so that Gatekeeper won't block it. Turns out it's pretty easy to get a fraudulent developer ID. You can either use a fake ID, or there's many for sale online. So all we have to do is get one of these certificates, re-sign it, again using the CodeSign -S flag, and now the system will no longer block Windtail because, again, we've used a new certificate that has not been revoked. Finally, we have MRT. This is another antivirus mechanism that's built into macOS. It's similar to XProtect, but scans for malware that already may be on your system, and then removes it if it finds it. So it's kind of like not really an on-demand scanner, but something that kind of runs in the background. If it detects any malware, it will delete it. However, unlike XProtect, the signatures for MRT are not in an external file, but rather embedded directly into the binary, which is kind of interesting because this means when Apple wants to add new AV signatures, they actually have to push out a whole new MRT binary. Really not the best design. However, if we run the strings command, we can see all the signatures for the malware that they detect. And we can see, for example, that also Apple has used MRT to delete legitimate software as well. So that's kind of an interesting aside. However, since MRT, like XProtect, uses signatures, it's equally easy to bypass. So if we disassemble the MRT binary, or if we look at the strings, we can see some strings embedded that match fruit fly, which recall was the first piece of malware we talked about repurposing. If we don't do anything to our repurposed sample, if we deploy it to new systems, MRT will pick it up and delete it. From our hacker point of view, that's not good. So let's look at how MRT is actually detecting and then removing fruit fly. So if we look at it, we can see that what it's doing, it's looking for the name of the launch agent and the name of the binary. This means when we install the repurposed version of Fruitfly, all we have to do is actually change either the name of the malware or the name of the launch agent, and now MRT will no longer detect it. So as I said, trivial to bypass. I briefly want to talk about bypassing third-party antivirus products as well, because you might run into a system that's running these. This has been talked about a lot. I'm not going to go into this too much, but suffice to say, if you modify the sample or pack it or encrypt it, it's generally not going to be detected, because especially on macOS, most antivirus products are signature-based versus behavior or runtime. So here, for example, I took Fruitfly. Recall it's a Perl script. I just Googled Perl obfuscator, chose the second one on Google, ran it through that, and this made the detections for Fruitfly, which there were a ton, because again, it's a known piece of malware, go from whatever it was all the way down to 0. Again, this isn't too surprising because these AV engines are using signatures, and we've totally changed the signature by modifying this. But there's a lot of other ways to do this. You could pack the malware, you could write an encryptor, or you could even execute it out of code. And I gave a talk at Black Hat a few years ago if you're more interested in what hackers can do to bypass traditional signature-based AV products. All right, so if you think about this for Mac users, who we all love, and our Mac users ourselves, this all kind of sucks. We showed that advanced adversaries are already using repurposed malware in their offensive cyber operations. And we also showed that it's actually really easy for anyone with some reverse engineering skills and basic hacker mentality to actually take very sophisticated malware samples, tweak a few bytes, and then be able to redeploy and infect pristine macOS systems. And unfortunately, the majority of detection mechanisms, both those that are built into macOS and third-party ones, may fail to detect these repurposed threats. And in my opinion, that's actually kind of lame, because if you think about it, these repurposed threats are functionally identical to the real ones, right? The ransomware is still in ransoming files. The backdoor is still exfiltrating files. So if these samples are already known, I don't see why we can't keep detecting them, even if they've been slightly tweaked or reconfigured. So we're going to end this talk by kind of switching gears. We're now going to be the good guys instead of pretending to be bad guys. And we're going to talk about ideas for generically detecting these threats. So first and foremost, it's generally a bad idea to detect malware based on signatures. The good thing is signatures are going to have very low false positives. So if you're writing an end-user security product, this may be very important. But as we showed, they are likely to fail. So what I think is a better approach is rather looking for the unusual or malicious behavior, because by definition, malware is going to do abnormal or malicious things. So let's kind of leverage this statement, this fact, with the goal of generically detecting macOS ransom, these repurposed threats. Because again, the point is, even if the malware authors or an attacker has gotten a piece of malware and has repurposed this, again, we're not changing the functionality. So if the backdoor tries to turn on the mic or the webcam to spy on the user, or installs a keylogger, even if an attacker repurposes that, it's still going to do those same behaviors. So if we're detecting or keying off those behaviors versus a sequence of bytes, this will allow us to detect both the original sample and any repurposed variants. So let's start with persistence. In my opinion, this is one of the best ways to detect malware. When we say persistence, we talk about, in the context of this presentation, a mechanism where malware tries to install itself so that the operating system will automatically re-execute it every time the system reboots. Because if the malware doesn't do this and the user reboots their system, they've basically just disinfected themselves. So there's a variety of ways that malware can persist, but what we can do is we can simply monitor the file system for known persistence locations for these known persistence techniques, and then when we see something persisting, we can take a closer look on this. I gave a talk about all the methods of persistence at RSA, or no, Virus Bulletin a few years ago. There's common ways such as login items, launch agents. There's some scripts that can be modified. But basically, we can watch for these and then detect persistence. So here, for example, we can now detect Windtail persisting, either the original version or the repurposed version, because we are just keying off its persistence versus its actual bytes. Next up, mic and webcam access. A lot of Mac malware will try to spy on users via the mic or the webcam. For example, the Fruitfly sample we talked about earlier. So instead of, for example, focusing on the bits and bytes of fruit fly, let's simply detect the fact that it's an application running in the background that when the user is not active, it turns on the webcam, right? That's really suspicious. That's not something that should ever happen. So what we can do is we can watch, or rather, register a callback with the operating system, and then macOS will actually tell you every time the mic and the webcam is turned on. So from that, then, we can detect anytime an application or a piece of malware is accessing the mic and the webcam, and then determine if that's malicious. Next up, keylogger detection. Malware often attempts to install a keylogger, so it can steal passwords, credit card information, information about who you're chatting with, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it turns out it's fairly easy on macOS to detect any time a keylogger is installed. Here we're just going to be talking about the most common types, and that is done via something called an event tap. So what we can do is, again, we can register a notification with the operating system, and there's a specific notification that if you register, you basically tell macOS, hey, I'm really interested in this fact, that fact being someone has added an event tap. An event tap is one very common way you do keylogging on macOS. So now, since we have this notification registered with the operating system, if a new piece of malware or a repurposed malware comes along and it has a keylogger capability, as soon as it goes to install that keylogger component, we will detect that and we will alert on that. So even if an attacker has changed the addresses of the command and control servers, repacked it, changed everything, as long as it's still keylogging, which it probably will because that's likely what the attacker wants to do, we will now be able to generically detect this threat. Fruit fly, we talked about earlier as well, also has the ability to do something called generate synthetic clicks. Synthetic clicks are just programmatic mouse and keyboard events, and this is a very powerful capability that malware often uses because it gives the malware the ability, for example, to interact with security prompts. You think about it, a lot of security prompts on macOS say, do you want this application to, access your mic, for example? If you can send a synthetic click and click on the allow button, you can basically approve yourself as malware. So this is kind of, again, a very powerful capability that malware has. So this is something we want to generically detect. Turns out, again, it's pretty easy to do that. You can register your own event tap, and then this will be invoked anytime there is a mouse move or a mouse click, rather. So then what we can do is we can examine that mouse click, and Apple actually sets a byte to 1, or rather 0, if that click has been synthetically generated. So we can generically now detect if any application is sending synthetic clicks, even if it's a piece of malware that has been repurposed. So at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned I was the creator of Objective-C. This is my personal Mac security product, and many of the detections we just mentioned are implemented in various tools. And a lot of these are open source as well. So if you are looking at ideas for how to implement this, not in a commercial product, but just if you want to figure out how to do this, check out the tools and the source code. Now, a downside to those Objective-C tools are they are all standalone. In the sense, if you want keylogger detection, there's one app for that. If you want mouse and keyboard or webcam, there's another app. So when I worked at Digido, we kind of wanted to take a different approach, and that was to cumulatively take all those detection mechanisms and put them into one tool, which makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of a neat idea, which I think we did. And the first step, and if you're designing a security product, these are some kind of interesting ideas as well, is that the first piece is we wanted to gather all the events from the system. So it turns out there's a lot of different subsystems you can tap into macOS that will give you alerts and notification, for example, when a keylogger is installed, if a user has inserted a USB device, is starting a new process. And then what we do is we wrote a whole bunch of rules or predicates that we then feed into Apple's game logic engine. And the idea is we have all this data and we have all these rules. We now need a logic engine to apply the rules onto that data in a very efficient manner. We didn't want to write our own logic engine. That's a lot of work. macOS, though, ships with one built in. Now, granted, it's for games, but there's nothing to say that you can't use it for detecting malware. So what we do is we feed all those events and rules into the game logic engine, and it spits out a result. Basically evaluates the rules on top of the data, and then very efficiently will detect a lot of the malware we talked about today. So let's briefly look at some of the rules we create and how to generically detect some of the malware we talked about today, both the original or the repurposed samples. So first up, let's talk about detecting windtail, specifically via its exploitation vector. So we can make a few observations that will allow us to generically detect it. First, we can detect that Safari is downloading and auto-extracts an application. Now, this is something that happens legitimately, so we don't flag on just that. We just kind of make a note that that event happened. That same application, though, registers a custom URL handler. That's kind of strange. And then that same application is launched via JavaScript from that same website to handle the custom URL scheme. So what we can do is we can combine the observation of all these three events, and if we see all three of these, we can say, hey, wait a minute, this is a very suspicious action. This is likely an exploitation attempt utilizing these custom URL schemes to launch a piece of malware. And again, the power of this is, this could be Windtail, a repurposed version of Windtail, or even a copycat actor who has just taken the exploit and is using it for their own purposes. We don't care. If we see this behavior, we're going to alert and flag. Similarly, we can also detect fruit fly at install time. We can, for example, monitor for its persistence. When we detect a persistence event has happened, we can look for other things because legitimate software will also persist as well. But what we can do, for example, is we can detect that the item that persisted was not signed by Apple. This is what fruit fly does. It pretends to be an Apple binary, but it's not actually signed. And it's also hidden. It starts with dot, right? This is very strange. So if you see a launch item that's being persisted that's not signed by Apple and is hidden, that's more than likely going to be malware. So again, we cumulatively detect those events and then generate an alert. Now imagine fruit fly has already been installed on the system. We can also go ahead and detect it by looking for suspicious or malicious runtime behaviors. So fruit fly does odd or anomalous things like running a hidden process, which then drops a unsigned binary to temp and then generates synthetic clicks. Like individually, all of those are kind of weird, but cumulatively altogether, that's really odd. That's really suspicious. Now, we probably don't want to trigger on each of those events. You could say every time I see a hidden process started, I want to collect that event or collect that process and look at it. Or you can cumulatively kind of keep going and say, okay, if it's out of temp or it's dropping and executing another binary, that's something that's very shady, especially if it then goes on to generate synthetic clicks, exfiltrates network data, turns on the webcam. Basically, you can choose where you want to set your threshold. Sometimes you just want to collect that binary for more analysis. Other times, you immediately want to alert the user and block and perhaps delete the file. OK, so this is a wrap. Hopefully, I've illustrated exactly how we can very easily repurpose Mac malware. The goal of that part of the talk is really not to enable hackers, but really show that actually advanced adversaries are already doing this, as we illustrated, and it's really not that difficult to do. So that means, obviously, hackers and nation states and three-letter agencies are doing this already. And that's very problematic because, as we showed, Apple's built-in malware mitigations and even traditional third-party AV tools really struggle to detect this repurposed malware, even though, again, the repurposed malware is functionally exactly equivalent to the known samples that are detected. So we ended by talking about generic detections that kind of focus more on runtime activity. It's always kind of a struggle between false positives and detecting anomalous events, but I think there's some middle ground where you can detect both new and even repurposed threats without generating a lot of false positives. So before I want to end, I just want to, again, thank you for all attending my talk. Thanks to MacPaw for inviting me to Kiev, my first time in Ukraine, having a blast, although it's a little cold. And I think we now have some time for questions. So if there's any questions, also I'll be around afterwards if you want to chat. I really like to talk nerdy about all this stuff, as you can clearly tell. So thank you again for attending. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Patrick. Thanks for the great presentation.
Welcome.
At first, I had probably a few questions, but later I decided to summarize it in one short question. What's the future of malware repatching? And let's start from a few questions and later migrate to one.
Okay.
So, for example, more and more products decided to implement behavioral-based checks.
Sure.
And for malware writers, it's hard to repatch some malware because, of course, it's easy for Fruitfly, for example, that gets C to a server from process args, but for like more advanced malware samples like Crisis or something, it would be much harder.
Sure.
So for malware writers, it's not reasonable. From my point of view, how much it makes sense to repatch Crisis or more advanced samples if more and more security products decided nobody decides to implement runtime-based checks?
Yeah, so great question. So I think there's two kind of pieces in there I'd like to discuss. First, it's generally better to repurpose simpler samples or less complex samples. For example, repurposing, if we're talking about Windows malware, something like Stuxnet would be incredibly difficult. You know, something that has multiple layers of encryption and custom packers, to get through all of that is just like, no. So what I generally try to do is if I'm looking for a sample to repurpose, I look for something like Fruitfly, which is very fully featured and probably gives you all the capabilities you want, but as we showed, you can just pass it the address of a command and control server. So generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend patching complex samples. At that point, there's some diminishing returns. Might as well write your own or use a simpler piece. As you mentioned, though, as more security tools go towards more behavioral detections, I think, yes, it makes less and less sense to repurpose malware. So that's kind of one of the hopes for the talk, is to illustrate to people writing security tools to go in that direction, because otherwise malware authors are going to, or hackers are going to continue to repurpose that. Because if everyone was doing behavior-based detections, it would, yeah, basically not make sense to repurpose malware, because these same detections would still detect even the repurposed things. So I think that's actually a really good mechanism as security tools go more and more towards behavioral-based checks. Hopefully, these nation states and people who are repurposing malware becomes less and less, because that would be ideal.
Probably the next question is, your presentation mostly related to user space malware. What about root level malware? And I'm not sure that most malware writers hesitate to implement in kernels, but in theory, three-letter agencies can leverage null days, 0 days,
sure,
and implement root-level malware. So, are there any researches regarding this thing?
Good question. So one of the problems is on Mac OS, if you're going to have a kernel extension, it's got to be signed, and Apple is really stringent about giving out signing certificates for that. So that's separate than the developer certificates. So obviously when we patch a repurposed piece of malware, we're going to change its signature. It's digital signature, so if it's code signed, that code signature is going to be broken, so it won't run. So in user mode, it's very easy to run unsigned code. It still runs. The user might have to click allow through some gatekeeper prompts, or you can very easily get a fraudulent developer ID. It's very, very difficult, though, to get one for kernel mode. The other problem is I'm not aware of any publicly available Ring 0 rootkit samples that run on recent versions on Mac OS. So yeah, so that would be an example. I don't know of any let's say research that's gone into that. But an attacker could perhaps, I believe Crisis, they mostly use that for rootkit stuff, like what, file hiding and process stuff. So usually the kernel mode component might not be super complex. But I still think then figuring a way to get that loaded in the kernel would be difficult. So you would either have to, like you said, have a 0 day that every time you throw that or launch that to then launch the unsigned driver. And at that point, it might make sense just to write your own. But the short answer to that is there's just not a lot of Ring 0 malware, publicly known Ring 0 malware out there. And I think Apple will eventually block third-party kernel extensions altogether. And so user mode is generally where people hang out and play. Thank you for the questions, though. Any others? Yes.
Hey, Patrick. Thanks again for such a great presentation. Thanks, MacPaw, for such a cool possibility. Yeah, my name is Bob. I'm from Red Team, and I wondered more in your miner. You have changed some path to the wallet, but the miner is still present on your laptop and it's still working. How will you deal with this situation? Or it's just removed, or how?
So it's actually going on right now. So I'm cryptocurrency mining while I give the talk. Figure,
Okay.
you know, multitask.
Okay, got it.
But to remove it, you would have to manually go in and delete the property list that persists it and the binary. So that's why it's always good to kind of fully understand the malware before you repurpose it. So if you install on a test system or you install it on a client system and you want to disinfect it, you have to know what steps to take. Windtail is great. You just reply with a 1 and it cleans up itself. But like you said, the cryptocurrency miner doesn't. But like I said, I'm still running it because, you know, I need a new winter coat.
Got it, thanks. And my second question is, how do you define the surface of attack? Is this something like, okay, today I will hack my laptop's camera, or how it works?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I actually don't do like a lot of bug hunting. So I used to work for the US government hacking. And so I always kind of have this hacker mindset. So when I'm writing a security tool or reading about a new Apple security feature or, you know, just poking around, you know, using macOS, I'm always kind of thinking of like, oh, I wonder how this can be abused. You know, it's just kind of spur of the moment. So I don't have a good answer for that. But for example, I've done a lot of research on the synthetic clicks, and I was analyzing Fruitfly, and I was like, oh, cool, like it has the ability to like click allow on buttons. So I was like, okay, you can dump the keychain. Okay, Apple now blocks that. So then I was just, from an interest point of view, I said, oh, how do they implement this? So I looked at that, and there was a bug in that. So that was kind of how I got to that. So I kind of just poke around and play, and then as things pop up that I think either there's not a lot of documentation about, which to me indicates it's probably hasn't been poked on or analyzed, those are always really good areas. Because unlike Windows, which I think has really been kind of hammered on a lot, Mac OS, like synthetic clicks, like I don't think anyone ever looked at it. So the bugs I find, they're neat, but they're not incredibly complex. If anyone else who does reverse engineering and has Mac security mindset would look, they would have, I think, found them as well. So I think it's just finding areas that are powerful, like you can do stuff like synthetic clicks, but that maybe someone hasn't kind of looked at before.
Yeah, got it, thanks. And last question from me. What is your biggest hack of macOS? Please tell your story.
It's probably classified. No, let's see, that's a great question. I like the keychain dumping one that I did. Again, it was via synthetic click because on previous versions of macOS, the keychain was not protected with a password. So all you did is you went to dump it, there would be a pop-up, and if you could click allow on that prompt, you could gain access to all the user's secrets and passwords. Again, if you had access to the Mac via some remote exploit. And that was kind of neat because the keychain, you know, is all these security mechanisms. And it was funny because Apple fixed that, and they didn't fix it right, so I broke it again. And Apple fixed it, and they didn't do it right, fixed it again. So it was kind of this cumulative like cat and mouse game where Apple kept screwing up. So that was kind of neat. I have some other bugs that I am still working on that if they work, will be pretty cool. You know, I always tell Apple because I want to make sure that, you know, we're all happy and safe. But yeah, I'd say the keychain one was pretty cool because again, you basically just send it one click and boom, passwords. Yeah. Yes. Great questions. Thank you.
Hi, Patrick. Thanks for the talk. So one question, what are you using for, like, what tools are you using for reverse engineering, and what tools are you using when you're dealing with malware? Is it like MacBook or some virtual systems? Do you have like some automations on those, like backing up
Sure.
and return to states?
Yeah. That's an awesome question. The tools I use for reverse engineering, I'm pretty manual, so I use LLDB, which is Apple's built-in debugger. Allows you to kind of single step through a binary and set breakpoints. I use hopper.app for a disassembler. It's kind of got some nice built-in features, like it's got a disassembler and a decompiler. So you can pretty easily reconstruct the somewhat source code representation of a malware sample. I also like it's like a Mac-specific app, where something like IdaPro doesn't really look that good on Mac, even though maybe it's more powerful. I haven't tried Ghidra. That's obviously the US government's open source tool. I've heard it's really good. You have to install Java, though, so I'm like, so yeah, my main tools are hopper.app and LLDB. And then for malware analysis, I just run a VM and turn off sharing and hope it can't escape. Ideally, you'd have a lab set up with a lot of separate hardware. But I'm not looking at a lot of malware. It's maybe one sample a month. So I don't automate anything. I basically get the sample, put it in a VM, and then I have like a file monitor, a process monitor, and then the debugger in the VM. And I kind of first will run the malware and just get an idea of what files it's doing and processes it's spawning. And then I'll also, in the disassembler at the same time, kind of step through. So it's a very kind of old school manual process, but I find it really gets me to all the details. And if the malware is doing something like anti-VM, which some Mac malware does, if I'm disassembling it too at the same time, I can see where those instructions are. And then in a debugger in the VM, I can just skip over those or knock those out so that the malware will execute in a VM.
Okay. Next question is more regarding like securing the system. And if you're writing an application or program that will defend you from some malware,
sure.
So technically what you need to do is look in the same places where malware will drop files, and you will need to listen for those events that malware will trigger. So technically you're almost malware from your behavior, right?
Yep.
And technically you need to have the same rights in some cases.
Sure.
You need to have root rights.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard to how do you say, to have those rights from the user.
Yeah.
Right? So user don't understand why do you need system extension.
Sure.
Right? So any suggestions or any like rules, because it's really easy to be detected as malware because of your activity.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to prove that you are not a malware.
Yeah, no, so the first thing is you definitely have to be running at the same or at least higher level as the malware. Otherwise, there's just no effective way. Like if you're not running with root permissions, a lot of the detection mechanisms we talked about, Apple won't even let you, for example, register for the callbacks or monitor the file system. So it's difficult for the users to approve that or allow that, but I think that's unfortunately the only way. Because if you're running it kind of like, and this is why like AV products from the Mac App Store, you're kind of like, like they can maybe scan your file system once, which is maybe a good thing, but they're not going to be able, as far as I know, to give you like real-time protection. I don't think they can like monitor processes and do like comprehensive system-wide stuff, which is what you want to do if you're writing a security product. Now, the point you make of, yes, at some point you almost look like a security piece of malware made me chuckle because I did some research on Kaspersky, and there were some claims in the US that they were being maybe abused to detect classified documents. And I said, I'm not going to read into that, but if they would, I want to see how they could do that from a technical point of view. And so on a VM, I installed Kaspersky. It's scanning every single document that hits the file system because it's looking for malware. And what it does is it connects to a server for signatures. And the way Kaspersky does it, they actually pass down executable code as signatures. So they actually run little shellcode snippets out of memory to scan for things. Again, this is kind of what malware would do. Again, I'm not saying they're malware. I just simply changed one of those signatures to instead look for malware, look for top secret and some keywords, and then detect and kind of pull that. So the point wasn't proving that Kaspersky was doing that, it was just that they could, and the reason I'm mentioning that is just to show that at some point an advanced comprehensive security product is essentially doing similar things to what a malware does. A malware might be monitoring your files and collecting them, exfiltrate when you start typing top secret documents. Well, a security product is also monitoring all your files, but it's just looking for other things. Now, I don't think that's a problem because ultimately the user is not really going to care as long as they trust you. And so it really just comes down to a trust thing. So if other security products are flagging that, I think that's problematic for them to do unless they have some good reason. Because they're also scanning files, and they're also monitoring for processes, and they're also installing hooks to do all sorts of stuff. So I think that's accepted behavior that every legitimate security product is doing, or all the good ones, basically, because they have to insert themselves into that chain. So if they're turning around and then saying other people can't do that, I think that they're probably doing that for maybe other reasons. Because if they're just doing that based on your actions, and your actions are really just for protecting the system, I don't think they have any argument. And because, they're essentially doing the same thing. So I don't know how you would tell them that. But
okay, so last question regarding, so if we collecting some information we're interested about, for example, if we looking for launch agents that looks for specific downloads, right? Which is, we know that it's 99% it's malware.
Sure.
Right? And so, actually, the question was, if our product is big enough, right, we are about to be hacked, right? What things we need to do to prevent from hacking, right? To prevent from usage of our own, web calls or persistence, or, for example, we have a root privilege agent, right? Which can be used from other applications.
Sure.
Right? Any specific rules or task list or checklist?
Well, first thing that's really good to be aware of that, because a lot of security products are not. And I love taking security products and finding ways to exploit them because they're running at the highest privilege, and it's very ironic where you're like, I got root thanks to Little Snitch or something. They had an exploitable flaw in their
we know about
extension. And we all write software, so we know it's hard to write. All software is going to have bugs, but I think there's definitely things you can do. So first, if you don't need a kernel extension, don't have a kernel extension, because that's just kind of a huge attack surface, and also Apple is kind of pushing third-party developers away from that. Anything you can opt into of Apple's new security features are great. So the hardened runtime is amazing because it basically prevents a lot of runtime injection attacks, which if you have a privileged daemon and an application that talks back and forth, even if you're verifying that agent, if someone can inject code into it, they can talk to your root daemon. And even if you're doing code signing checks and entitlement checks, those are all at the process level. So if someone's got code in that process, it's kind of game over. So I would say, obviously code sign everything. If you can opt into the hardened runtime that Apple now offers, that gives you a huge thing. And then just think like an attacker. So what features are you exposing that run as root? Okay, maybe it's scanning a file or something. Cool, that's maybe not that bad. Even if a malicious person somehow can make that request, scan random files. But if it's doing something like executing a command, okay, maybe you really want to think about that. So I would say try to reduce whatever you do at higher privilege levels, and for those things, maybe almost assume a bad person can do that and figure out what damage they can do, and then figure out how to kind of reduce basically comms interfaces, because a lot of times, like I said, if there's a low-level privileged app, your app talking to that, figure out how to kind of secure that. And it's hard. Everyone gets it wrong, and like you said, when you get popular, you're going to get targeted, but that means you've made it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Great questions, though.
I have one more
small
question. Do you ever tried your exploits on your friends? Because, I have started from this, and...
Is this still being recorded?
I don't know.
They're usually witting. I'm like, hey, can you run this and tell me what happens? But no, for me, it's like a slippery slope. I don't really like to cross any lines, because it's like, as we have these power and capabilities, like, I mean, it's tempting to, like, you know, start doing bad things. So me, I try to really stay on the straight and narrow. But if it's a joke or something, you know, I'm like messing around with my friends' computers, I think that's all fair. With the expectation they're probably trying to do it back to me. So, yeah, it's part of the fun.
Yeah, of course.
Exactly.
More questions? Okay, guys, I think that's it. Thank you, Patrick, for such a great speech.
Thank you.